Most people believe anxiety means something inside them is broken. That if the heart races, if the mind searches for danger, if the chest tightens for no clear reason, then something must be wrong. So they try to fight it. They try to control every thought, silence every worry, and push the feeling away. But strangely, the harder they fight their anxious heart, the louder it seems to beat. Here's the quiet truth most people never hear. An anxious heart usually isn't asking to be controlled. It's asking to be comforted. Like a small lantern trembling in the wind, it doesn't need force. It needs steady hands around the flame. In this story, you'll meet someone who believed his anxiety meant he was fragile. Someone who spent years trying to silence the wind inside his mind, until one simple conversation changed the way he understood his own heart. And what he learned was surprisingly gentle. A small practice that can calm even the most restless thoughts. Because safety, as it turns out, doesn't always come from the outside world. Sometimes it begins in a quiet moment, with a single breath, a simple sentence, and the decision to treat your own heart with kindness. And once that shift happens, something remarkable begins to unfold. But to understand why, we have to begin with a man who carried a trembling lantern inside his chest. There are moments when the heart begins to race without warning. No loud event, no clear reason, yet something inside feels unsettled. A quiet tension creeps into the chest, like a small bird fluttering against a closed window. The mind, almost automatically, starts searching for danger that isn't really there. And somehow, the harder it searches, the louder the flutter becomes. For many people, that feeling arrives in the middle of ordinary life, standing in line at a store, reading a message that feels slightly cold, hearing a tone of criticism. Nothing dramatic, really. Yet the body reacts as if a storm is approaching. The breath shortens, the shoulders tighten, and thoughts begin stacking like restless dominoes. It's strange how quickly the calm of a moment can slip through the fingers. Some people try to ignore it. They push the feeling down the way one might close a creaky door and pretend the wind stopped. But anxiety has a curious way of lingering, like a faint tapping on the glass. Even when the world outside looks peaceful, something inside keeps whispering, something isn't right, and that whisper can be exhausting to carry. Imagine for a moment that anxious feeling as a small lantern trembling in the dark. Its flame flickers wildly whenever a breeze of worry passes through. The lantern isn't broken. It's simply exposed to every gust that wanders by. Still, when the flame dances like that, it casts long shadows across the mind. Shadows that make ordinary moments feel heavier than they really are. People often wish someone would appear right then. A calm voice saying, "It's all right, you're safe." But life doesn't always offer that kind of company at the exact moment the heart begins to shake. Sometimes the room is quiet, the phone is silent, and the thoughts grow louder. And in those moments, a quiet question begins to form. What if reassurance didn't have to come from the outside? What if the trembling lantern could be steadied by the hands holding it? It sounds simple, almost too simple, but the idea lingers like a soft echo. Because deep down, most hearts carry the same hidden wish. A wish to feel safe, even when no one else is there to say so. There once was a man named Daniel who knew that restless flutter very well. His days looked ordinary to everyone around him. Yet inside, he often felt as if he were holding that shaking lantern. The smallest gust, a sharp comment, an unanswered message, a memory, could make the flame jump. He tried to shield it with logic, distraction, even a bit of stubborn denial. But the lantern kept trembling all the same. One evening, after a particularly long day of quiet inner storms, Daniel noticed something curious. The lantern in his mind wasn't dimming. It was simply asking for steadier hands. He didn't yet know how to offer them, but somewhere ahead, someone would show him a gentler way to hold that fragile light. And that small discovery would begin with a conversation he never expected. Daniel carried that trembling lantern everywhere, though no one else could see it. At work, during quiet dinners, even while walking beneath the evening sky. Whenever worry brushed against his thoughts, the flame inside the lantern flickered again. He often tried tightening his grip, as if control alone could calm it. But strangely, the tighter he held it, the more the flame seemed to shake. For a long time, Daniel believed the lantern needed discipline. He told himself to be stronger, calmer, more reasonable. He repeated quiet commands in his mind the way someone might scold a frightened animal. Yet the lantern responded the same way frightened creatures often do. It trembled harder whenever it felt pushed. One afternoon, after a restless morning filled with small frustrations, Daniel sat alone in a park. The air was cool, and the trees whispered softly above him. Still, inside his chest, the lantern danced nervously again. A passing memory of criticism from earlier that day had stirred the wind. It was remarkable how such small moments could shake the flame. He sighed and rested his elbows on his knees. For a moment he simply watched the ground and listened to his breath. That's when something subtle occurred. The lantern's flame didn't grow stronger because he controlled it. It softened slightly because for once he stopped fighting it. It was a tiny shift, almost easy to miss. Instead of tightening around the lantern, Daniel loosened his hold. He imagined cupping it gently, the way someone protects a fragile light from the wind. Oddly enough, the flame steadied just a little. Not perfectly, but enough to notice. That small moment carried a quiet lesson. The lantern didn't calm because it was commanded to behave. It calmed because it felt sheltered, like a nervous child who relaxes when someone kneels beside them rather than towering above. The difference was subtle, yet deeply important. Later that evening, Daniel found himself thinking about it again. Perhaps the heart worked the same way as that lantern. Perhaps anxiety wasn't a problem to wrestle into silence. Maybe it was a signal asking for something gentler, something closer to care than control. Of course, Daniel didn't yet know how to practice that kind of kindness toward himself. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost awkward. Still, the thought stayed with him as quietly as a candle glowing in the corner of a room. And before long, someone would cross his path who understood that lantern very well. Someone who knew exactly how to steady a trembling flame. Daniel's days had slowly begun to revolve around the trembling lantern, not in ways people could easily notice, of course. From the outside, he looked like someone simply moving through life, answering messages, nodding in conversations, showing up where he was expected. But inside, the small flame in his chest seemed restless more often than calm, and the effort of hiding that restlessness had started to wear him down. Mornings were usually the hardest. Before the day had even fully begun, his mind would wander toward small uncertainties. A meeting that might go poorly, a message that might sound wrong, a memory of someone's sharp tone from the day before. The lantern would begin to flicker, gently at first, then more insistently, and Daniel would quietly wonder why such small breezes felt like storms. So he tried what many people try. He ignored the lantern. He told himself it was silly to feel this way, that stronger people simply moved on. Sometimes he buried the feeling under distractions, scrolling through his phone, filling his schedule, keeping his mind busy. But the lantern had its own way of reminding him it was still there. A tense comment from a coworker could make the flame jump suddenly. A delayed reply from a friend might send shadows dancing across his thoughts. Even a quiet evening alone could stir an uneasy whisper inside his chest. The lantern wasn't just reacting to big events. It trembled at the smallest winds of uncertainty. What troubled Daniel most was the quiet story forming in his mind. He began to wonder if something inside him was fragile in a way other people weren't. Maybe, he thought, his lantern had been built too delicately. Maybe everyone else had stronger glass, steadier flames, calmer winds. It was the sort of thought that settles slowly but heavily. There were nights when he lay awake, replaying conversations. A single careless phrase he had spoken hours earlier might echo again and again. Each memory sent another small gust against the lantern's flame, and as the shadows stretched along the walls of his thoughts, Daniel felt a familiar fear. What if he was simply broken in some quiet way? Still, something about the lantern kept him from giving up entirely. Even when it trembled wildly, the flame never went out. It flickered, yes, sometimes wildly, but it remained alive. That stubborn little glow seemed to carry its own message, a message Daniel didn't yet understand. One afternoon, after a particularly long morning of inner storms, he stepped away from the noise of the day. He wandered toward a quiet place where the wind moved gently through tall trees. The lantern was trembling again, its light restless in his chest, and it was there, quite unexpectedly, that someone would notice the way he held it. Someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to calm a flame like that. The place Daniel wandered into that afternoon was quiet in a way that felt almost protective. Tall trees leaned gently toward one another, and the wind moved slowly through their branches. He sat on an old wooden bench, elbows resting on his knees, eyes drifting toward the ground. Inside his chest, the lantern trembled again, its little flame fluttering nervously. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine it clearly. In his mind, the lantern was small and delicate. Its glass was thin, the kind that chimed softly when the wind brushed against it. The flame inside glowed warm but uncertain, dancing whenever doubt passed nearby. Sometimes it leaned to one side as if trying to stay alive in a storm. Other times it steadied, but only for a moment. Daniel pictured himself holding it carefully in both hands, not tightly, just enough to keep it from falling. He noticed something curious in that image. Whenever he imagined clutching the lantern too firmly, the flame flickered more wildly. But when his grip softened, the light seemed calmer. It reminded him of a frightened child trying to fall asleep in a dark room. If someone bursts in with loud reassurance, the fear often grows sharper. But when someone sits quietly nearby, breathing slowly, the room begins to soften. The child doesn't need force. The child needs presence. The lantern, he realized, felt much the same. It didn't want commands shouted at the wind. It wanted shelter from the wind, a pair of steady hands around its fragile glass, hands that didn't treat its trembling as a failure. Daniel watched the trees sway gently above him. Their branches moved easily with the breeze rather than resisting it. For a moment, he wondered if his lantern had simply been exposed for too long. Not broken, not defective, just unprotected from every passing gust. It was a strange thought, but oddly comforting. He took a slow breath without even planning to. Then another. The lantern in his mind steadied slightly, the flame rising straighter for a moment. It was such a small change that he almost laughed at it. Still, the light felt warmer than it had earlier. And just as he was noticing that small shift, someone nearby spoke with a calm voice. Not loud, not startled, just gently present, like someone who had been sitting there all along. The voice carried the quiet tone of someone familiar with trembling lanterns, someone who didn't seem surprised by fragile flames at all. And Daniel soon realized that this quiet stranger had been watching the way he held the light. The voice came from the other end of the bench, soft enough that it didn't startle him. Lanterns flicker more when we try to command the wind, the stranger said gently. Daniel turned, a little surprised that someone had spoken the very image in his mind. Beside him sat an older man with calm eyes and a quiet smile. He looked like someone who had spent many years watching storms pass. For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. The stranger didn't seem hurried, didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't offer advice too quickly. Instead, he simply sat there, as if silence itself were part of the conversation. The breeze moved through the trees, carrying a slow rhythm through the air, and somehow, Daniel felt less alone with the trembling lantern in his chest. You look like someone holding a fragile light, the man said after a moment. His tone held no judgment, only a gentle recognition. Daniel let out a small breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was strange how relieving it felt when someone noticed without trying to fix. Like a quiet nod that said, "I see it too." Daniel admitted, almost shyly, that his thoughts often felt like restless wind. The lantern in his chest, he explained, never seemed to stay steady for long. Sometimes criticism stirred it, sometimes loneliness, sometimes nothing at all. He worried that maybe the lantern itself was flawed, that maybe other people carried stronger flames. The older man chuckled softly, the kind of warm sound that carried no mockery. Lanterns aren't meant to fight storms alone, he said. He gestured lightly toward the trees swaying above them. Even the tallest trees bend with the wind instead of arguing with it. His voice carried the calm certainty of lived experience. Daniel watched the ground for a moment, letting those words settle. The stranger continued, still gentle, still unhurried. Most people try to calm their lantern by controlling every breeze, he said, but the flame doesn't understand control. It understands care. The man picked up a small fallen leaf from the bench between them. He held it lightly between his fingers, as if demonstrating something simple. When something fragile trembles, he said, the answer is rarely force. It's warmth, presence, patience. The kind of patience people often forget to offer themselves. Daniel looked down at his imagined lantern again. For the first time, he wondered what it might feel like to treat that fragile light with kindness. Not fixing it, not scolding it, just protecting it the way someone protects a small flame. The idea felt unfamiliar, but strangely hopeful, and the man beside him seemed ready to show exactly how that might be done. The older man watched the breeze move through the trees for a moment before speaking again. Most people believe they must silence the wind, he said quietly. But wind has its own nature. It comes and goes. He tapped the wooden bench gently, as if marking a simple truth. What matters is how we hold the lantern while the wind is passing. Daniel listened carefully, his shoulders relaxing just a little. The man placed his hand lightly over his own chest, right where a heart would beat. When the lantern begins to tremble, he continued, the first thing is to slow the body. He took a slow breath in through his nose, then let it leave his lungs just as slowly. Daniel noticed the rhythm immediately. The man wasn't forcing the breath, only guiding it, the way someone might guide a boat toward calmer water. 2 slow breaths can change the wind inside you, the man said. 3 breaths can steady the hands holding the lantern. Sometimes that's all the flame needs. The older man then lifted the small leaf he had been holding earlier. Its edges trembled slightly in the breeze. Imagine this leaf is your anxious thought, he said gently. You don't crush it. You simply hold it lightly, and let the wind carry it when it's ready. Daniel tried it quietly right there on the bench. He imagined the lantern again, cupped gently between his hands. He took 1 slow breath, then another. The flame didn't stop moving entirely, but it seemed less frantic, like a candle slowly remembering its shape. The man nodded, noticing the shift without needing Daniel to explain. You see, he said softly, the lantern responds to kindness faster than commands. Fear tightens the hands. Compassion steadies them. Then he added something Daniel hadn't expected. Sometimes I even speak to the lantern, he said with a warm half-smile. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet sentence. He tapped his chest again gently. Something like, it's all right, I'm here. Daniel couldn't help smiling slightly at that. The idea felt simple, almost childlike, yet oddly comforting. A quiet phrase, a slow breath, steady hands around the fragile light. Perhaps safety wasn't something to chase after all. Perhaps it was something the body could learn to create. And though Daniel didn't realize it yet, he would soon need that small secret. Because life, as it often does, was about to send another gust of wind. The kind of moment that once would have shaken the lantern wildly. But this time the flame might meet the wind in a very different way. Over the next few days, Daniel carried the memory of that conversation with him. Not like a grand revelation, but more like a small match quietly tucked in his pocket. The lantern in his chest still trembled from time to time, of course. Old habits of worry don't disappear overnight. But now he had something gentle to try when the wind returned. One morning, while reading a message that felt colder than expected, the familiar flutter appeared again. The lantern flickered sharply, shadows jumping across his thoughts. For a moment, Daniel felt the old urge to tighten his grip and argue with the feeling. But then he remembered the man's calm voice beneath the trees. Slow the body, steady the hands. So he paused. Not dramatically, just a quiet pause between 2 moments. He placed his hand lightly over his chest, almost like someone checking the warmth of a candle. Then he took 1 slow breath, and another. The wind didn't vanish, but the lantern stopped shaking quite so wildly. It became a small practice he repeated throughout the week, a critical comment during a meeting, a memory that surfaced while lying awake at night. Each time the lantern trembled, Daniel imagined cupping it gently in his hands, and each time, the flame steadied a little sooner. Something else began to change as well. Daniel stopped speaking to himself with that harsh inner voice. Instead of thinking, "Why are you like this?" he tried a different sentence. "It's all right," he would whisper quietly under his breath. "I'm here." The first few times felt awkward, almost like trying to speak a language he had forgotten long ago. But gradually the words started to feel natural, and strangely enough, the lantern seemed to listen. Its flame began to hold steady for longer stretches. One evening, while walking home beneath the fading light of sunset, Daniel noticed something remarkable. The lantern was still there, still fragile, still sensitive to the wind, but it no longer felt like an enemy he had to control. It felt more like something living that trusted his hands, something that only needed gentle shelter. And in that quiet moment, Daniel realized something simple but powerful. The lantern hadn't changed nearly as much as he had. His hands had become steadier, his breath slower, his presence warmer. Of course, life still had its gusts waiting ahead. Unkind words, unexpected disappointments, lonely evenings. The wind of the world never completely disappears. But Daniel was beginning to understand something important. And soon, that understanding would be tested in a moment he once would have feared. A few days later, the wind returned in a way Daniel knew well. He was sitting at his desk when a short message appeared on his screen. The words were brief, a little sharp, the kind that often carry more meaning than they show. In the past, that single sentence would have stirred a storm of thoughts, and sure enough, the lantern in his chest flickered the moment he read it. For a second, the old reflex tried to take over. His mind began searching for hidden criticism, replaying the words again and again. The flame trembled, shadows rising along the walls of his thoughts. Once, this would have been the start of a long spiral, but something inside him remembered the quiet bench beneath the trees. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let the message rest where it was. He didn't answer immediately, didn't chase the meaning behind every word. Instead, he placed one hand gently over his chest, almost absent-mindedly, like someone checking on a small light in the dark. And then he breathed. One slow breath in, one slow breath out, then another. The lantern still moved, but the frantic shaking softened into a smaller sway, like a candle that had found shelter from the wind. Daniel whispered quietly under his breath, the same words he had practiced before. "It's all right. I'm here." The sentence felt simple, but it carried a surprising warmth. Not dramatic reassurance, just steady presence, the kind someone might offer a frightened child or a tired friend. After a minute or so, the shadows in his mind grew lighter. The message on the screen no longer felt like a storm cloud. Just words, possibly careless, possibly misunderstood, possibly nothing at all. The lantern's flame stood straighter now, calm within its glass, and Daniel noticed something quietly powerful. He hadn't needed to silence the wind. The wind had come and gone exactly as winds do. What had changed was the way he held the lantern while it passed. Instead of gripping it with fear, he had sheltered it with patience, and that simple shift made the whole moment feel different. As the afternoon moved on, Daniel realized something that would have surprised the version of him from months ago. An anxious moment had appeared, and then gently dissolved. No battle, no collapse, no long spiral of doubt. Just a lantern, a pair of steady hands, and a few slow breaths. And somehow that small practice felt like the beginning of something larger. Of course, Daniel knew the lantern would still flicker in the future. That was simply its nature. But now he carried a quiet confidence he hadn't known before. A quiet understanding that calm could grow from the inside outward. And it was exactly this simple discovery that he would soon share with others. Some evenings, when the world grew quiet and the day's winds finally softened, Daniel would remember the small lesson from the park. He would sit somewhere comfortable, sometimes by a window, sometimes at the edge of his bed. Nothing ceremonial, nothing dramatic. Just a moment of stillness with the lantern he now understood a little better. A moment to check how the flame was doing. One night, he noticed the lantern trembling again after a long day. A passing comment from someone earlier had stirred doubt in his mind. The flame flickered gently, not wildly like before, but enough to catch his attention. Instead of pushing the feeling away, Daniel smiled softly to himself. He knew exactly what to do. He placed one hand over his heart. Not tightly, just resting there like someone protecting a candle from a breeze. Then he took a slow breath in through his nose, the kind of breath that fills the chest without rushing, and he let it leave slowly, like air drifting out of a quiet room. He repeated the breath again, letting his shoulders soften. In his mind, he pictured the lantern clearly, glass steady, flame warm, hands gently cupped around it. Then he whispered the same small sentence the old man had once shared. "I am safe right now." The words weren't loud or dramatic, just simple, like a calm voice in a dark hallway. And strangely, the lantern seemed to listen. Daniel sometimes repeated the phrase 2 or 3 times, not as a command, but as reassurance, the way someone might reassure a nervous animal or a tired friend. With each breath, the flame steadied a little more, and the shadows in his thoughts grew shorter. After a minute, the moment would pass. The lantern still glowing, the room still quiet. Nothing miraculous had happened, no grand transformation. Yet Daniel always felt lighter afterward, as if the lantern had remembered how to trust his hands. And over time, he began to realize something even deeper. Perhaps the heart doesn't truly need complicated answers during anxious moments. Perhaps it only needs a small ritual of care, a breath, a gentle sentence, a steady pair of hands around the flame. And in that quiet understanding, another truth was slowly beginning to reveal itself. With time, Daniel began to notice something that once would have seemed impossible. The lantern in his chest still flickered now and then, just as all lanterns do. A harsh word here, a lonely evening there, a memory drifting in unexpectedly. But the flame no longer felt like a problem waiting to be fixed. It felt like something alive that simply needed gentle care. One evening, as twilight stretched quietly across the sky, Daniel returned to the same park bench. The trees still swayed with their patient rhythm, just as they had before. He sat there for a while, watching the light fade through the branches. Inside his chest, the lantern glowed softly, not perfectly steady, but peaceful. He thought about how long he had spent trying to control the wind, trying to force calm through effort, through criticism, through resistance, and how little that struggle had actually helped the flame. The lantern had never needed discipline. It had needed kindness. The truth felt surprisingly simple when he finally saw it clearly. An anxious heart is not a machine that requires tightening screws. It's more like a small light in a fragile glass lantern. When the wind comes, the answer is not force. The answer is warmth and shelter. Daniel realized that safety isn't always something the world provides first. Sometimes it begins with the way we sit beside our own trembling flame, the way we breathe when fear arrives, the way we speak softly to ourselves instead of raising our inner voice. Those small gestures quietly change everything. The lantern, after all, had never been broken. It had only been waiting for steady hands. Hands willing to pause instead of panic. Hands willing to protect instead of criticize. Hands willing to stay. And in that quiet understanding, the flame seemed to glow warmer than before. Not brighter because the wind had disappeared, but brighter because the lantern was finally being cared for. And a cared-for flame carries a different kind of light, the kind that warms rather than frightens. So the lesson Daniel carried forward was gentle, but deeply true. A heart does not find peace by being controlled. It finds peace by being understood. And when kindness becomes the hands that hold the lantern, even the wind begins to feel a little less frightening.